Let's be clear. Canada and the US are the only non-European members of NATO, but NATO's response to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the US was a critical factor. And you don't have to do much of a thought experiment to imagine what would have happened had Donald Trump been in office in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine.
So in America, Aaron, you'll know NBC, the news network, their sources close to the president, President Biden, say that he's privately scathing about Benjamin Netanyahu, that he's extremely frustrated. But what's his next move beyond being frustrated, beyond being privately scathing?
I mean, I wouldn't start, frankly, John, with, we can come back to the issue of Washington, but I want to make a more elemental point, which is too often ignored. It's stunningly obvious. Like so many conflicts, Zelensky and Putin, just to use an example, the two primary combatants in this conflict, Israel and Hamas, have controlled the trajectory of this conflict since its inception. And they are the primary decision makers.
Yeah.
And 5 months into this war, it should become clear, painfully, tragically obvious to everyone, including the United States and Great Britain, that the leverage that Great Britain and the United States is prepared to use in order to fundamentally alter the trajectory of their calculations is quite limited. Now, we can circle back to Washington, and for all the rhetoric and the frustration and the annoyance and the aggravation, even the hostility, the president has chosen some pretty trenchant four-letter words, 3 and 4-letter words, presumably, reportedly, to describe his views of the prime minister.
Yeah.
There's a reluctance to use pressure, to impose costs and consequences. And frankly, right now, I think the administration is in an investment trap. They need Benjamin Netanyahu to make two decisions. One is on an Israel-Hamas prisoner exchange. Without that, John, you can hang a close for the season sign on British and or American aspirations for de-escalating the situation in Gaza. For all his transgressions and failings, and there are so many, Benjamin Netanyahu has the support of the vast majority of the Israeli public, who are focused far more on destroying Hamas. Certainly, I'm not sure that's possible, and probably would support a campaign in Rafah, although I doubt, frankly, if that's imminent, nor have you heard any objection from either the Minister of Defense, who can't stand the Prime Minister, or Benny Gantz, who sits in the War Cabinet. You've heard no opposition to the possibility that the Israelis will at some point, probably weeks from now, assuming there's no hostage for prisoner deal, and there may be, support that campaign. So I think we're overestimating, I don't know the right words, the degree to which any external power is prepared to change fundamentally the trajectory of the current conflict.
In a word, we should expect, you believe, the situation in Gaza, the numbers of Palestinian dead, the situation to get much, much worse before it ever gets better, maybe long before it ever gets better.
No, I think there's a serious prospect. CIA Director Burns is going to be in Cairo tomorrow. An Israeli delegation is in Cairo tomorrow. The Qataris and the Egyptians obviously are in Cairo. And there's a serious negotiation to determine whether or not a hostage for prisoner exchange, accompanied by a significant de-escalation of Israeli military activity in central and southern Gaza, and perhaps even in the north, could lead to an extended cessation of hostilities for as many as 3 months.
Well, that's so interesting to hear you say that, Aaron. Can you say you're remotely optimistic about that?
No. I mean, nobody ever lost money. I've worked on Israeli-Palestinian issues for 25 years inside the U.S. government. Nobody ever lost money betting against Israelis and Palestinians doing the right thing. And I would only add one more. I mean, I'm quite conscious of the exponential rise in Palestinian deaths, the tragedy, the appalling humanitarian consequences of what the Israelis have wrought. But I think we also have to remind ourselves, as I do, that this is not a conflict between Israel and Egypt, where both sides have legitimate needs and requirements that need to be met. This is a conflict between Israel and Hamas, an organization which is the organizational embodiment of an idea, which is the destruction of Israel and its replacement by an Islamic State. And I think that serves. I'm not trying to make a polemical point here. I'm trying to use it as to explain why Britain and the United States will not use significant pressure to impose costs and consequences on Israel's war aims.
Yeah, it's really, really good to get your perspective, Aaron. Just a bit of Reuters, I should say now, a bit of breaking news. Hamas armed wings say that 3 of the 8 Israeli hostages who were seriously injured after Israeli airstrikes have died from their wounds. More on this story, of course, later in the programme. But before you leave us, Donald Trump's comments at the weekend about NATO members needing to pay more for their own defence, or he said he would encourage Russia to do what the hell it likes with those countries. That's caused shock, I think it's fair to say, on this side of the Atlantic. What is your take on it?
I think it's emblematic, John. If you thought 2016 to 2020 was bad, and there you had several restrainers, including people like H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, even Mike Pompeo, counseling prudence and caution with respect to Trump's determination to undermine America's alliances around the world. If the presumptive Republican nominee gets in again, you're going to see much worse. And as an American, frankly, the damage to this republic is going to be extensive. So I think Europeans have a lot to worry about in a second Trump presidency. But so do my fellow countrymen and women.
Aaron, I need to move on, but I can't resist asking you one brief final question. There is a view, isn't there, in Washington that this is the way Trump behaves, this is the way Trump talks. There are breaks in place. There's now a legislation that says Congress has to approve withdrawal from NATO. Is it possible for him to override all of that and withdraw from NATO and carry out these threats?
No, but I think there are constraints and limitations. It's just that with a Democratic administration, John, you have an emergency supplemental of critically needed assistance to Ukraine, which has been stalled for months. And I think it's not necessary for Trump to withdraw from NATO. He can starve it, and he can undermine America's role in it. And let's be clear, Canada and the US are the only non-European members of NATO, but NATO's response to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the US was a critical factor. And you don't have to do much of a thought experiment to imagine what would have happened had Donald Trump been in office in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. It's chilling, and I'm sorry to drone on, but it's worth pointing out, John.
Well, it's a dark analysis, but it is very, very interesting to hear. And as always, to have you on our program, Aaron David Miller, former Middle East negotiator in America. Thank you.